Hello and welcome to the show, The Truth Unveiled. This show is all about exposing the hidden truths about religion and most especially Christianity. I am your host for today, Mary, and in the last episode we discussed the conclave and the Catholic Church in a state of crisis. And in this episode, we are going to discuss the historical effects of modernism. I have here with me Father John Okerulu. So Father, can you tell us the reactions during the time that modernism was condemned by Pope St. Pius X?
Yes, that's a very important question because people don't know history. I see there's this saying, anyone who doesn't know history is doomed to repeat the mistakes of history. I'm paraphrasing now, I don't really get that. I think it's from a secular philosopher. So, and that is true. The reason why the world is the way it is today is because there are forces that they have been trying for a long while to dismantle everything that looks like Christianity in its original state. Because of course they had already conquered, they had in their pockets Protestantism. So the next bulwark that they needed to bring down was the Catholic Church. However, they found it difficult to bring down the Catholic Church because of the papacy. And so they sought to first of all get their own men into the seminaries who became priests, who became bishops, who started bringing all the errors and the heresies of Protestantism, but their main focus was to undermine the papacy. So the errors is known as modernism, and so when during the pontificate of Pope Leo the 13th and Pope St. Pius X, that's when they actually saw modernism for what it was and strenuously condemned it. But Pope St. Pius then wasn't content with just condemning modernism. He actually they allowed some people who would actively combat modernism because he saw that modernism, like he said, that the enemies of the church are not now to be found from without, from outside, but from within. So he saw that their goal was to achieve to the highest office in the Roman Catholic Church, which is the papacy. And so he saw the need of giving a guidance to a group known as Sodalitium Pianum. It was formed under the Archbishop Benigni, giving them a kind of a guidance and a kind of a papal blessing to root out, to see the modernists within the Catholic structures, and then those who are teaching modernism, and then get them excommunicated. But the reaction wasn't so favorable, you see, because, like I said, these people were undermining the papacy, and so the reactions amongst the bishops wasn't favorable. So you had this counter reaction to the actions of the Pope through this Sodalitium Pianum known as Episcopalism. Episcopalism was this thing where the bishops saw themselves as popes in their own dioceses, whereby whatever directive comes from Rome, they don't implement it, they just take it as nothing. I'll give an instance. When the Pope wrote the document Pascendi Dominici Gregis condemning modernism, he gave a directive that the bishops of dioceses should give a report, a yearly and later triennial report into the happenings in their dioceses, whether these tenets were being taught by their seminary professors or by any priest, and then they report back to Rome, and then Rome will give further guidance on that matter. Well, you won't believe it. Most of the bishops said, even the places, even that the Pope knew the modernism was wreaking serious havoc, they say, well, there's no modernism in our diocese. Well, it's enough that the Pope has already condemned it. That's fine. We are vigilant. We are looking at our professors. The professors have been put in seminaries and schools by us. So don't worry, everything is fine. So they almost treated it with kid gloves. You see, that it's not important. It's not something that we should be worrying ourselves about. You see, but that was the ploy. The ploy was to undermine the seriousness of the matter. You see, and this insipid attitude or this lack of zeal can be seen. It's St. Paul said it says, bad company corrupts good manners. So because of the fact that these bishops were surrounded by men who were filling their heads with the thought of this pride, the bishop of this diocese, the Pope is in Rome, you are the one in charge, and all of those kind of things. So don't worry, don't take seriously what he said, and also from the entities, whether in a very subtle way from the civil government, whether in France, whether in Italy, whether in Germany, particularly in Germany, because they didn't take the popes anything seriously there. So the bishops, and being surrounded with these people, they saw themselves as a kind of mini pope in their diocese, so they didn't regard what came from Rome. And then they felt that the other party that was faithful to the Pope, which is called the integral Catholics, as opposed to the moderate Catholics, they are undermining Episcopal jurisdiction. And so that's the origin, you see. So that's why the fact that the Pope wrote in serious terms, condemned modernism in very serious terms, the effect, or would I say, the implementation of those condemnations were taken very lightly amongst the Catholic episcopacy. So that's the sad effect. And I would say, this saying they say that what an old man sees sitting, a child doesn't see on the highest tree. That's precisely what we are facing today. That the Pope St. Pius X, understanding his role as a pope, you see, he had this foresight. He saw the principles that these modernists were using, and he saw where it was leading to, and he saw the need not just to condemn it, but to institute a system whereby the modernists would be rooted out. He has communicated quite a number of modernists, you see. But these bishops, being for whatever reason, not having that zeal that should animate them as bishops, that their primary responsibility is to not only feed the sheep with wholesome food, but to protect them from wolves. That's important. You don't only feed the sheep with wholesome food, but you protect them from wolves. They didn't see that other aspect of their responsibility. So yes, they will say we are feeding them with wholesome food, but the sheep are still surrounded by wolves. So that's the problem, and most of them, I'm sure, I will answer for that. You see, they are not there. So that's the encounter at the beginning of modernism. So after Pope St. Pius X died, the modernists, there was this pacifist attitude, peaceful approach by the successors of Pope St. Pius. If they had followed his agenda in the same zeal and vigor, probably Vatican II would not have happened when it happened. But you see, like the successor of Pope St. Pius X, Pope Benedict XV, Pope Pius XI, and also Pope Pius XII, these three Roman pontiffs were not, they actually dismantled that society I spoke about, so that listen piano, whose goal was to seek out modernists in the different places and then report back to Rome, and Rome would then probably one and excommunicate them or remove them from their offices. They dismantled that same piano. They said that it was detrimental, this society was detrimental to episcopal jurisdiction. And all of those people that were removed, some of them were reinstated back into their offices. Those that are suspected of heresy or modernism, where that was dropped against them. So you see this counter approach to modernism. You should note that these popes actually wrote encyclicals condemning modernism. They did. So you see Ubi Acarno of Pope Benedict XV and the Mortalium Animos and so many other encyclicals that condemn the tenets of modernism, but they did not see it as a need to combat it hand to hand. You see, someone comes in with a gun, you're carrying a machete, the person will just shoot you and blow you up. So that's what they didn't combat modernism in the same way as Pope St. Pius did. They condemned it quite alright, but they didn't apply their condemnation, apply it to the logical way. The tactics, they didn't follow tactics by tactics. So for instance, Pope Benedict XV said, no one should say we are integral Catholic, we are moderate Catholic. It's enough to say Catholic is my name, Christian is my surname. He's the one who said that, Pope Benedict XV, 14th, not 15th, 14th, XB, Pope Benedict XV. But that was how he saw it. Just say you're a Catholic, that's enough. But these people, these modernists, they saw it as a field day for them, whereby they would now be able to carry out their subtle errors, you see. all of these are we could say, the origins and the reactions to the reactions and counter reactions to the initial condemnation of modernism by Pope St. Pius X. Now, some people, there are so many authors that have written on it, and then some, by the way, all of these things we know from because Pope St. Pius X was canonized by Pope Pius XII, and so there's this document known as Disquisitio, which essentially was trying to say that Pope St. playing the devil's advocate, that Pope St. Pius X wasn't worthy of canonization. And so you have some people coming and saying that he was hostile to the Catholic hierarchy, the Catholic bishops, by his stance on modernism or the implementation of his condemnation of modernism. But the question now is, were there excesses in the implementation of the condemnation of modernism? I will say yes. Were they, how did Pope St. Pius react to it? He actually tried to, he cautioned the integral Catholics, those who were against modernism, he cautioned them to respect Episcopal authority in the different dioceses, actually. But in the same way, he was quite slow and vindictive in terms of the Pope could remove a bishop from a diocese, but he never did so. You see that? Those modernizing bishops, those bishops that were sympathetic to modernism, he didn't remove them from there. Or even cardinals, Cardinal Ferrari, I think the cardinal, the Archbishop of Venice, was one of such cardinals who opposed him in supporting the integral Catholics against modernism. Whereas this cardinal, actually Cardinal Ferrari, was actually also they call him, he was on the other side, the mild Catholics, those who were who are tapping on the back modernists and saying, don't worry, be good, without actually telling them, see, what you're doing is wrong, that kind of thing. So that's it. So on the one hand, you have the excesses of those against modernism. On the other hand, you have the people who are supporting modernism, not doing anything at all to curtail the bad effects of it. Because, like I said, a child who is on the tallest tree doesn't see what the old wise man sees just sitting on the ground or sitting on the chair. So that's actually what the reactions and the counter reactions to the condemnation of modernism under Pope St. Pius X.
Oh, I see how it went now. So, but how is it that after Pope St. Pius X condemned modernism, how is it that the Second Vatican Council still enshrined modernism after that?
It's a very, very, very important question. Like I said before, the subsequent pontiffs, Pope Benedict XV, I made a mistake before, Pope Benedict XV, Pope Pius XI, Pope Pius XII, they treated modernists with kid gloves. Those modernists and modernizers that were either removed from their office, or that whether they are professors of seminaries, whatever office they held in the church, or those condemned, were now accepted again, brought back into their offices. You can imagine that. Someone who is doing something, that's to show you that although they understood that modernism was bad, was an error, a heresy, they treated modernists with kid gloves. An example comes, there's the Sillon. Sillon was a movement in France that initially the Sillon was a movement that had a social movement that pushed the church's social teachings. But all of a sudden, they found that Monsignor Sagnier is a French cleric. He started teaching anti-Catholic principles, trying to teach democratic principles. They started to teach separation of church and state. And because of all this, saying that the Sillon movement was not annexed to any Catholic cause, it was clearly secular. That's what he said, Sillon. And so because of this, Pope St. Pius condemned the Sillon. We say that he condemned with a heavy heart because they had initially started well, trying to push the Catholic cause, trying to push the Catholic social teachings in France, but they just diverged, just like that, in a very short space of time. That's to show you the intent behind what they did. And he condemned them and said everything should stop. But of course, the Bishop Sagnier continued silently, still even formed the Democratic Party in France, still pushing the same agenda. Now, John the 23rd, he said he extolled in 1950. He extolled this Sagnier, saying that when this man had he learned a lot from him in his youthful priest, in his days as a young priest. Can you imagine that? And extolled the senior movement that was condemned. And he even went to say that, yeah, that when he was silenced and when his movement was condemned by the church, that he accepted it to show you his great spirit and all of that. But you can imagine where people extol people whose agenda were contrary to the church's mission. You see, contrary to the church's own teaching. When you start extolling people, say you learn from them, it shows you that you yourself are actually, you have imbibed those teachings condemned by the church. You see that? So we see, and the church didn't say anything. The popes were silent. The popes recouped. I mean, it was Pope Pius XII who made John the 23rd the cardinal. I mean, John the 23rd was a suspect of modernism during the time of Pope Benedict XV. So all of this is what we see, where the church was not taking that proactive step to extirpating, to removing modernism from within the ranks of the church. So that's why the modernists were able to have a field day to ascend the ladder of modernism, because the pontiffs didn't see they didn't see it as much a threat, and modernists were very clever to hide their real intent. They come and sound as though modernism wasn't bad. It was like trying to merge the ideas, the harmless ideas in the society with the church. You see, to augment, to bring to bring up to date the church's views. That's what John did. We call it Condemnation Vatican II. So when he was invalidly elected Pope, he then wanted to see how the church would validate all of these principles that were condemned by the church. So that's how Vatican II happened, because it was almost like after Pope St. Pius X died, the fight against modernism stopped in practice, not in principle. In practice, because the pontiff were not proactive, but in principle, because in principle, they still condemn modernism. Very important to make that distinction. It's almost like someone coming out and shouting, dressing immodestly is bad, don't dress immodestly to church, and when you see immodest people trooping into church, you don't do anything about it. I say, they don't know. Yes, if they don't know, you tell them that dressing immodestly to church is not good, and you shouldn't come to church dressed immodestly. You see that? So that's why in principle they still condemn modernism, when in practice they did nothing, very little, to extirpate it from the church. That is how modernism essentially became enshrined at the Second Vatican Council. And now I will also add something more, that in case anybody might be having doubts about the church's condemnation of modernism. First of all, the church as a loving mother, is anything that comes from her, we have to receive it with serene mind and heart, not just outwardly obeying, but interiorly following, because the church cannot tell us to do anything that is bad, that is sinful to observe. Can't give a law that is sinful. That's against the infallibility of the church, at least the secondary infallibility of the church. So, to show you that the church wasn't wrong, as it's like a kind of a confirmation, is seen from what happened after Vatican II. Now, after Vatican II, Europe, America, all these once formerly Catholic states saw a drastic decrease in vocation. We see the priests, nuns, leaving the priesthood in droves because of Vatican II and their false principles. When you teach that, when you remove, in fact, that's, by the way, that's the condemnation of Silian. I don't have it with me, but the condemnation of Silian says once the restraint that keeps people on the right path is removed, man, being inclined to evil, would opt to that path. Pope Gregory XVI said that in Miraribus, when all the restraints that keeps people on the narrow path is removed, man, being inclined to evil because of original sin, would head that way. So Vatican II, when they started teaching the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church, that non-Catholic sex and means of salvation, and all of these very heretical, blasphemous statements that essentially says that you can save yourself in any religion as long as you're a good guy. Then the question is, why do we need to be celibate? Why do I need to take all of these strict laws when I can as well save my soul in any religion? I can live my life the way I want to live it and not see. So the essentially leads to loss of faith. Loss of faith in the sense that you don't see the Catholic faith as the only true faith that you must believe and practice to save your soul. So that's why statistically there's a whole lot of abandoning the true faith, not only by the faithful, but also by the clergy and the religious, who are supposed to be champions of the faith. So that's the bad effect. So when you go to a church, you see they dwindling in numbers. Those who even come, they don't even believe in key doctrines of the church or dogmas, like the holy, believe in the real presence of the Holy Eucharist and all of that. It all began from Vatican II. And what did our Lord say? Our Lord says, by their fruits you shall know them. This thing is what everybody can attest to. This is completely undeniable that the sudden decrease in the attendance at Mass, the sudden decrease in vocation, the sudden decrease in the religious life is a direct effect, direct effect of the Second Vatican Council. And then somebody will now argue, but in Africa, in Nigeria, we have so many vocations. We have people flooding the list, and I'll tell you, it's a very simple thing. See, you can't deceive a child who doesn't know anything, but you can't deceive an adult who reasons. Now, in Nigeria, there are 5 vocations. Yeah, right. Go to Enugu, go to Anambra, and see how the whole place is now flooded with people who don't believe. People who now shrines and this African religion is entrenched everywhere again. Someone told me that in the 1960s and the 1970s, that it was very hard to find openly a shrine that is the practice of an African religion in the East. That the missionaries are actually having such good fruit from before Vatican II. But today, as you have so many vocations in the diocese, even the smallest diocese in the East can boast of over 200 priests. The smallest one can boast of over 200 priests. But yet you see this high level of irreligion, high level of pagan practice. By their fruits you shall know them. It's not something that is far-fetched. By their fruits you shall know them. So it's not about the number. We can fool. Garigu once says, 1,000 idiots do not equal one guru. So you can have 1,000 people who flood into the Novus Ordo in Africa, but all of them don't have the faith. And that's what we are seeing in this return to pagan practices. It's not something that is far. Go to the East and verify, and you see what I'm saying. It's not something that is far. You see? So these are sure signs that Vatican II, that the condemnation of modernism as the synthesis of all heresies is right, is true. You see? Because the effects have been bad. In the West, loss of vocations. In Africa, yes, increase of vocations of people who don't know what the faith is all about, and a rise in pagan practices. This is what tells us that in fact, the Vatican II religion does not teach the Catholic faith, but something else. What does it teach? Modernism. What is modernism? According to Pope St. Pius X, modernism is the synthesis of all heresies. They are the most pernicious of the enemies of the Catholic Church. So he says in Pascendi, and so it is to this very day.
Wow, Father, thank you for that distinction and explanation you gave us. This shows how unfortunate and sad it is that we are now living in the consequences of lack of commensurate opposition in practice to the errors of modernism. And I believe this calls us not just to oppose modernism in principle, but also in practice as upholders of the true Catholic faith. That'll be all for this episode. And in the next episode, we are going to discuss the errors or principles of modernism that led to the wide-scale defection from the Catholic faith. Stay tuned. This is still the Truth Unveiled show.